January 17, 1945. The Ardennes Forest, Belgium. The snow falls in silence, thick and unrelenting, blanketing the shattered pines and the frozen corpses alike. A German Oberst, a colonel whose iron cross hangs heavy beneath layers of wool and desperation, stands at the edge of a cratered road, watching the horizon through field glasses fogged with his own breath. Behind him, his men huddle around oil drum fires, burning furniture torn from Belgian farmhouses. Their stomachs are hollow, their ammunition crates half empty. The horses that once pulled their supply wagons lie dead in the ditches, their ribs stark against hides too tough now even for soup. The Oberst lowers his binoculars and permits himself a bitter smile. Somewhere to the west, beyond the fog and the artillery smoke, the Americans are flailing. He knows this. His intelligence reports confirm it. The great Yankee war machine, built on Hollywood optimism and assembly line arrogance, has ground to a halt. Their vaunted logistics, that supposed miracle of industrial organization, has collapsed under the weight of German steel and winter cold. The roads are choked. The fuel depots are burning. The supply lines, stretched thin across France and into Belgium, are snapping one by one like overtaut wire. They are shopkeepers, the Oberst mutters to his adjutant, a gaunt lieutenant whose cheeks are sunken with hunger. Not soldiers, shopkeepers playing at war. It is a belief shared by many in the German High Command during those bleak days of the Battle of the Bulge. From the bunkers of the Westwall to the command posts deep in the Eifel forests, Wehrmacht officers whisper the same comforting lie to one another, that the Americans lack the discipline, the endurance, the will to sustain a modern war of movement and mass, that their logistics are a facade, impressive on paper but fragile in practice, that once the initial momentum of their industrial wealth runs dry, they will falter, negotiate, perhaps even withdraw. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt himself, architect of the Ardennes offensive, has expressed skepticism about American staying power. In staff meetings, he speaks of the U.S. Army as a force reliant on overwhelming material advantage rather than tactical ingenuity, a machine that functions only when conditions are ideal, when roads are clear and supplies abundant. Sever those roads, burn those supplies, and the machine, he believes, will seize up like an engine starved of oil. This is not mere prejudice, though prejudice certainly colors it. The German military has a long tradition of viewing itself as the apex of martial professionalism, an institution where officer training is rigorous, where strategic thought is elevated to an art form, where soldiers are conditioned to endure hardship as a matter of honor. The Americans, by contrast, seem to the Germans like amateurs, citizens in uniform, drafted from offices and farms, more comfortable with Coca-Cola and jazz records than with the grim calculus of modern warfare. Their logistical system, while undeniably vast, strikes many German commanders as bureaucratic and inflexible, dependent on fixed supply chains vulnerable to disruption. And for a few days in late December 1944, this belief seems justified. The German offensive smashes through thinly defended American lines with savage speed. Entire battalions are encircled, fuel dumps fall into German hands. Panic ripples through Allied headquarters. The great port of Antwerp, the linchpin of the Anglo-American supply network, appears within reach. If it falls, the whole Allied front in northwestern Europe will collapse for want of ammunition, food, gasoline, the sinews of mechanized war. But the Oberst, standing in the Ardennes snow, does not yet understand what is already in motion. He cannot see, beyond the smoke and the trees, the machinery of American logistics shifting into a gear that no European army has ever possessed. He cannot comprehend the scale, the speed, the sheer industrial violence about to be unleashed, not with bullets, but with boxes, barrels, and crates. He will learn soon enough. To understand the moment that is coming, one must first understand the nature of the war America has chosen to fight.
This is not a war of desperate improvisation, of making do with whatever comes to hand. It is a war of deliberate, calculated excess, a war in which victory is
achieved not merely by defeating the enemy's army, but by smothering it beneath an avalanche of material so vast that resistance becomes not just futile, but absurd. The roots of this philosophy stretch back to the first days after Pearl Harbor, when American military planners sat down to confront a terrifying reality. The United States would have to fight a global war on two fronts, separated by oceans, against enemies who had been preparing for years. There would be no time for gradual buildup, no luxury of learning through small colonial skirmishes. The scale would be immediate and total. The solution, articulated by men like General Brian Somervell, commander of the Army Service Forces, was to turn America's industrial capacity into a weapon as deadly as any tank or bomber. Factories that once produced automobiles would churn out trucks by the tens of thousands. Shipyards would float cargo vessels faster than submarines could sink them. Railways, highways, and ports would be transformed into a continent-spanning conveyor belt, funneling the output of American farms and mines and mills toward the front lines with relentless mechanized efficiency. This is not how the Germans wage war. The Wehrmacht is an army of horses and railroads, its supply lines dependent on the narrow-gauge tracks of occupied Europe and the endurance of millions of requisitioned animals. For every German truck, there are 3 horses. For every motorized division, there are 5 that march on foot. The German logistical system is not designed for deep, sustained offensives across shattered infrastructure. It is a creature of Europe's dense rail network, optimized for short, violent campaigns where victory comes before supplies run thin. The Americans, by contrast, have built an army designed to function anywhere on Earth, under any conditions, indefinitely. Every infantry division is accompanied by thousands of trucks. Every corps has its own quartermaster units, engineer battalions, and signal companies. The U.S. Army in Europe consumes 500,000 tons of supplies per month, more than the entire Wehrmacht consumes in a season, and the system is engineered to deliver that staggering tonnage without pause, without failure, without mercy. But systems, no matter how well designed, are not invincible. And in late December 1944, as German panzers race westward through the snow, the American logistical network is strained to the breaking point. The Germans have seized key crossroads. They have ambushed convoys. They have forced the U.S. Third Army to pivot north in a desperate counterattack, stretching supply lines even thinner. For a brief, flickering moment, it seems possible that the Oberst's contempt is justified, that the Americans will falter, choke on their own disorganization, and cede the initiative back to Germany. But what the Germans do not realize, what they cannot realize, is that the American logistical apparatus is not a fragile web of dependencies. It is a redundant, self-healing organism, capable of rerouting, recalculating, and overwhelming any disruption through sheer brute force. Where the Wehrmacht has 1 supply route, the Americans have 10. Where the Germans count their trucks in hundreds, the Americans count in thousands. And when the moment comes to prove this, when the test arrives in the form of a single impossible demand, the system does not break. It accelerates. The demand comes from General George S. Patton. It is January 1945, and the Third Army is locked in a brutal slugging match to relieve the besieged town of Bastogne and drive the Germans back across the German border. Patton's divisions are advancing, but at enormous cost. Ammunition is being expended at rates that defy pre-war planning assumptions. Fuel consumption is astronomical. The men, fighting in sub-zero temperatures, require constant resupply of rations, winter clothing, medical supplies. Entire battalions are immobilized for want of gasoline. Artillery batteries fall silent for lack of shells. Patton, never a man given to patience or understatement, demands the impossible. He needs 12,000 tons of supplies delivered to the front within 48 hours. Not 5,000 tons, not 8,000, 12,000. Enough to feed, arm, and fuel an entire army for days of sustained combat.
And he needs it delivered across roads that are choked with snow, cratered by artillery, jammed with refugee columns and retreating units. The kind of demand that, in any other army, would be met with resignation or excuses, but the U.S. Army Service Forces does not deal in excuses. Within hours of receiving Patton's request, logistics officers across the European theater of operations swing into action. Depots in Normandy and Cherbourg, hundreds of miles to the rear, begin loading trucks. Convoys are assembled, routes are calculated, priorities are reassigned. The machinery of American abundance, momentarily slowed by the chaos of battle, roars back to life. The plan is audacious to the point of recklessness. 500 trucks, an armada of 2.5-ton workhorses, each driven by men who have not slept in days, will form a continuous convoy stretching across Belgium. They will drive through the night, through enemy artillery fire, through blizzards that reduce visibility to a few yards. They will not stop. They will not rest. They will deliver 12,000 tons in 48 hours because the alternative is unthinkable. And so they do. On January 17th, the convoy begins to roll. The trucks move in columns, headlights dimmed, engines growling through the cold. Each vehicle carries 6 tons of cargo: crates of 105mm howitzer shells, jerrycans of gasoline, pallets of K-rations, bundles of wool blankets, boxes of plasma and morphine. The drivers are a cross-section of America. Farm boys from Iowa, mechanics from Detroit, Negroes from the segregated Red Ball Express units who have proven themselves the backbone of the logistical effort. They drive without maps, guided by painted signs and the taillights of the truck ahead. When one vehicle breaks down, it is shoved into the ditch and the convoy continues. When drivers fall asleep at the wheel, their passengers slap them awake. When fuel runs low, they siphon from abandoned German vehicles. The Germans, entrenched in the hills overlooking the roads, watch in disbelief. Their own supply situation is catastrophic. They are scavenging food from dead Americans. They are mixing sawdust into their bread. Their tanks sit motionless for want of fuel, their crews reduced to fighting as infantry. And now, in the middle of a battle that was supposed to break the Allies, they see this: an unending river of trucks, each one laden with more supplies than an entire German regiment possesses. A captured German officer, interrogated days later, will describe the sight in tones of exhausted bitterness. "We watched them," he says. "We counted the vehicles. After 200, we stopped counting. We had no ammunition to attack them. We had no fuel to pursue them. We could only watch. And we knew then that we had already lost." The convoys reach Patton's forward units within the promised 48 hours. 12,000 tons, not 11, not 10, 12. The exact amount demanded, delivered on time despite weather, terrain, and enemy action. Artillery batteries roar back to life. Tanks refuel and lurch forward. Soldiers, half frozen in their foxholes, receive hot rations and dry socks. Small mercies that, in the arithmetic of morale, are worth their weight in ammunition. Patton himself, never one to lavish praise lightly, is visibly moved. In his diary he writes, "The supply people have performed a miracle. A lesser army would have collapsed. We have not merely survived, we have advanced. This is what happens when competence meets abundance." For the German Oberst standing in the snow, the realization comes slowly, then all at once. His intelligence officer brings him reports. The Americans are no longer retreating. They are resupplied. They are advancing. They are, impossibly, stronger now than they were a week ago. The offensive, which began with such promise, is crumbling. Not because of superior tactics or heroic stands, though there are plenty of both, but because the Americans have done something the Germans cannot. They have moved mountains. This moment, this convergence of industrial power and logistical genius, is more than a tactical victory. It is a revelation of philosophy, a clash of worldviews made manifest in trucks and tonnages. The German military tradition, forged in the crucible of Prussian discipline and refined through a century of European warfare, prizes efficiency above all else. The ideal German army is lean, mobile, professional, an instrument of precision that strikes hard and fast, achieving victory before the enemy can.
Mobilize his resources. The German Blitzkrieg, the lightning war, is the ultimate expression of this philosophy. Concentrate overwhelming force at a single point, smash through, and exploit the chaos before the enemy can react. It is a doctrine built on the assumption that wars are won by maneuver, by superior training, by the intangible qualities of leadership and morale. But this doctrine has a fatal flaw, one that the Germans have not fully reckoned with. It cannot sustain itself. A blitzkrieg is a sprint, not a marathon. It consumes fuel, ammunition, and men at a prodigious rate. And if the enemy does not collapse, if he absorbs the blow and fights on, the offensive grinds to a halt. The Germans have experienced this in Russia, where the vastness of space and the resilience of Soviet resistance turned their lighting war into a quagmire. They are experiencing it now in the Ardennes, where American stubbornness and logistical depth have blunted their last great gamble. The Americans, by contrast, have embraced a philosophy of abundance. They do not seek to fight efficiently, they seek to fight overwhelmingly. Where the Germans ask, "How much do we need?" the Americans ask, "How much can we deliver?" Where the Wehrmacht husbands resources, doling out ammunition and fuel in careful rations, the U.S. Army floods its units with supplies, sometimes wastefully, sometimes excessively, but always with the understanding that in modern war, material superiority is not an advantage, but a prerequisite. This is not a philosophy born of arrogance, it is born of pragmatism. The United States entered the war with a small, under-equipped army and a vast, untapped industrial base. It could not compete with German tactical sophistication or Japanese fanaticism in the early years, but it could outproduce them. It could turn every factory, every shipyard, every farm into a node in a war machine that grew stronger with each passing month. By 1945, the American economy is producing more war material than the rest of the world combined. The challenge is not production, it is delivery. And in this challenge, the U.S. Army has succeeded beyond all precedent. The convoy that delivers 12,000 tons to Patton's Third Army is not an anomaly. It is the standard. It is what the American logistical system does, day after day, across Europe and the Pacific, in jungles and deserts and frozen forests. It is the reason American soldiers joke, bitterly and proudly, that they never run out of anything except time. For the Germans, this abundance is incomprehensible. They have spent years fighting a war of scarcity, where every liter of fuel is precious, where every shell must be counted. They have developed a kind of grim ingenuity, a talent for improvisation that allows them to keep fighting long after their supply lines should have collapsed. But improvisation, no matter how skillful, cannot compete with a system that does not need to improvise, that is already planned for every contingency, that has built redundancy upon redundancy, that can lose 1,000 trucks and replace them in a week. There is a story, perhaps apocryphal but widely circulated among American soldiers, of a captured German officer being taken through a U.S. supply depot in France. The depot sprawls across acres, mountains of crates stacked under canvas tents, rows of trucks waiting to be loaded, field kitchens serving hot meals around the clock. The officer stares in silence for several minutes, then turns to his escort and says, simply, "You have already won. We are fighting a war. You are moving a country." It is an astute observation. The American war effort is not merely military, it is civilizational. It is the projection of American abundance, American optimism, American organizational genius onto a global stage. It is the belief, arrogant and perhaps naive, but undeniably effective, that any problem can be solved through sufficient application of resources. And in January 1945, standing in the snow of the Ardennes, watching the endless parade of trucks roll past, the German Oberst finally understands what he is facing. He is not fighting an army, he is fighting an idea. The idea that freedom and prosperity are not antithetical to military power, but the very foundation of it. That a society which feeds its citizens well, clothes them comfortably, and grants them a voice in their own governance, will, when threatened, mobilize with a ferocity and efficiency that no dictatorship can match. It is a bitter lesson, and it has come too late. The trucks themselves become symbols, icons of a clash not just of armies, but of ideologies. Each vehicle, a GMC CCW or a Studebaker US-6, is a marvel of mass production, stamped out by the thousands in factories from Detroit to Indiana, shipped across the Atlantic in Liberty ships that themselves are products of assembly line efficiency. The trucks are not elegant, they are not sophisticated. They are blunt instruments, built for durability rather than beauty, designed to function under the worst conditions imaginable. And yet, to the men who drive them and the soldiers who depend on them, they are beautiful. They are proof that someone, somewhere far away, cares whether they live or die. That the nation they represent has not forgotten them, has not left them to fend for themselves. That when they call for help, the answer is not hold on or make do, but here is more than you asked for. To the Germans, the same trucks are objects of despair. Every convoy they see is a reminder of their own impotence, their own dwindling resources. They count the vehicles and do the math, calculating how many tons of supplies are passing beyond their reach. How many American soldiers will be fed and armed with those supplies? How many more days the war will drag on because the Americans can afford to be wasteful? There is a particular cruelty in this disparity, a psychological dimension to the logistical dominance. The German soldier, sitting in a frozen foxhole with a half ration of bread and a few rounds of ammunition, does not need propaganda to tell him that his cause is lost. He can see it in the sky, where American aircraft roam unchallenged. He can hear it in the distance, where American artillery fires without pause. And he can see it on the
roads, where the trucks roll past in an unending stream, indifferent to his existence. For the Americans, the abundance is both a strength and a source of guilt. Some soldiers, veterans of earlier campaigns in North Africa or Sicily, remember what it was like to fight on short rations, to scrounge for ammunition, to make every shot count. They remember the fear that comes with scarcity, the gnawing worry that the supplies will run out before the battle is won. Now, in 1945, that fear seems almost quaint. There is always more food, always more fuel, always more ammunition. The challenge is not survival, but victory. And victory, while still costly, feels inevitable. Yet this abundance does not make the war easier, it makes it stranger. There is a disconnect between the grinding brutality of combat, the mud, the blood, the shattered bodies, and the almost casual efficiency with which the rear echelons supply the front. A soldier can kill a man in the morning, watch him die in agony, and then return to his bivouac in the evening to find hot coffee, clean socks, and a letter from home. The juxtaposition is jarring, almost obscene, a reminder that modern war is not a single experience, but a spectrum, ranging from medieval savagery to industrial routine. The Germans, by contrast, experience the war as an unrelenting descent into deprivation. Every day brings less food, less ammunition, less hope. The contrast is not lost on them. In letters home, in diaries recovered from the dead, German soldiers write with a mixture of bitterness and awe about the American logistics. They have everything, one soldier writes. We have nothing. How are we supposed to win? The answer, of course, is that they are not. The logistics have already decided the war. The battles are merely the final act, the bloody formalities required to translate industrial superiority into political surrender. The symbolic weight of the convoy, of those 500 trucks delivering 12,000 tons in 48 hours, extends beyond the immediate tactical impact. It becomes a story, a legend, a proof of concept that will shape military doctrine for generations. In the years after the war, as historians and strategists dissect the Allied victory, the logistics will emerge as one of the decisive factors, perhaps the decisive factor. The genius of Eisenhower, the courage of the infantrymen, the ferocity of the Soviet advance, all of these matter. But none of them would have been possible without the trucks, the ships, the railways, the depots.
without the unglamorous work of the quartermasters and the truck drivers and the supply clerks, men whose names are forgotten, but whose labor sustained the entire war effort. The convoy to Patton's Third Army is a microcosm of this larger truth. It is not the climax of the Battle of the Bulge. That comes later, with the grinding reduction of the German salient, the relief of Bastogne, the crossing of the Rhine. But it is the turning point, the moment when the German hope of disrupting American logistics is shattered beyond recovery. After this, there is no doubt. The Americans will advance, the Germans will retreat, the war will end. For the German Oberst, the realization is personal as well as strategic. He has spent his career believing in the superiority of German military professionalism, in the idea that discipline and training and tactical brilliance can overcome material disadvantage. It is a comforting belief, one that allows him to take pride in his service even as his nation commits unspeakable atrocities. But watching the trucks roll past, watching his men starve while American soldiers feast, he cannot sustain the illusion any longer. The Americans have not won because they are better soldiers. They have won because they are richer, because their factories are intact, because their homeland has not been bombed into rubble, because they have the luxury of abundance, the arrogance to believe that every problem can be solved by throwing more resources at it. It is not fair, it is not just, but it is effective. And in war, effectiveness is the only virtue that matters. The epilogue to this story is not written in the Ardennes. It is written in the decades that follow, in the world that emerges from the ashes of the Second World War. The logistical miracle that sustained the Allied victory does not end with the surrender of Germany and Japan. It becomes the template for the American-led international order, a world in which supply chains span the globe, in which goods flow across oceans with unprecedented speed and volume, in which abundance is not a privilege but an expectation. The trucks that delivered 12,000 tons to Patton's army are the ancestors of the container ships and cargo planes that now carry consumer goods from Asia to America, from Europe to Africa, from everywhere to everywhere. This is the legacy of American logistics, not just the winning of a war, but the creation of a system that assumes, as an article of faith, that distance is no barrier, that scarcity is a problem to be solved rather than a condition to be endured, that the world can be remade through the application of organization and will. It is a system with flaws. It is wasteful. It is vulnerable to disruption. It has enabled exploitation, environmental damage, inequality. But it has also lifted billions out of poverty, connected cultures, and sustained a level of global prosperity unimaginable in 1945. And it all began with trucks. Trucks rolling through the snow in Belgium, driven by men who did not think of themselves as heroes, who were simply doing their jobs, who understood that the war would not be won by grand gestures, but by the unglamorous accumulation of small victories. Trucks carrying not just supplies, but a promise, that the society they represented would take care of its own, that abundance was not an accident, but a choice, that freedom and prosperity were inseparable. The German Oberst, standing in the snow, watching the convoy pass, does not live to see this world. He dies in the spring of 1945, shot by a sniper during the retreat across the Rhine. But in his final weeks, as the front collapses and the Reich disintegrates, he writes a letter to his wife. It is never sent. He carries it in his pocket until the end, but it is recovered from his body and preserved in the archives. "We were wrong," he writes. "We thought we were fighting shopkeepers, but they were never shopkeepers, they were builders, and they have built something we cannot destroy." It is perhaps the most honest epitaph for the war that any German officer ever penned. A recognition that the conflict was not merely a clash of armies, but a contest of systems, of philosophies, of visions for how human society should be organized. And that in this contest, the side that embraced abundance, that believed in feeding its soldiers, supplying its armies, and trusting its citizens, had always been destined to win. The trucks roll on, the snow continues to fall, and somewhere in the distance, beyond the smoke and the ruin, the future is being delivered,
1 ton at a time.